Well, ladies and gentlemen, we come to our fourth keynote. Our Professor Maria Cristina from Italy. So you are highly welcome, Professor.
Can I share my screen now?
Yes,
Yes.
you can, sir.
Okay. All right.
Right. So
Can you see everything?
not the speak, sir.
When you want, I can start. You
You
tell
can
me.
start, sir.
I can start? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really glad that you are organized this conference. My talk today, as you can see from the title, is about expectation, conjecture, and beliefs. In particular, I will try to convey the message that there is something common in the work of these three great economists, Marshall, Kahn, and Keynes, and they all belong, of course, to the Cambridge tradition, and that's one of the reasons why we would like to see them as part of the same methodological approach. Okay, so let me start by giving you the background of this talk by saying that the main focus of my analysis is to try to review how in the literature we deal with the question of how people form expectations and how they make conjectures, because this is what most economic agents do all the time when they make decisions. They make decisions about production, about consumption, about buying or selling anything on the basis of some expectations of what the future would be like. Okay, if you expect price to increase, you buy now. If you expect you're a seller, you wait until the price is higher before you sell. So expectation and conjecture was the difference. I will try to show you the difference between expectation and conjecture in a minute. But in economics, in the literature, we have two ways to address these issues. One is to see how expectations are modeled or formalized in models, be they micro or macro models. But on the other hand, we have also literature who's dealing with the question of how you deduce expectation and conjecture, either from interviews or, like in behavioral economics, in experiments. Okay, so these are two ways in which we deal with the issue of expectation in the literature. In a very, very general terms, we have two basic approaches. The third one is a sort of variation on the first one. The way in which we deal with the expectation in our models is to use the assumption that expectations are based on what has happened in the past. So when people have to make assumption about future behavior of certain variables, they take as a benchmark what has happened in the past. And we call this adaptive expectation. In other words, we believe that the past is going to be very similar to the past or to the present, and we tend to project into the future what we have experienced as happening in the past. And this is what we call adaptive hypothesis. So if the wage rate has been running to a certain level, we assume that, generally speaking, we will make the assumption that the future will be like the present. Second approach is completely different, and it came into fashion, I think, in the 90s, even if it was anticipated in a famous article by Muth much earlier. In the rational expectation, you form expectation on the basis of some model, okay? You know what the model of the economy is like, so you assume that agents know, and they behave, quote unquote, rationally, not on the basis of the past, on the basis of the understanding of what the model of the economy is like. Why did the rational expectation supersede adaptive hypothesis? Well, because people, when expectations were disappointed, it has to assume that people change their mind. Instead, the idea of adaptive hypothesis is that you don't change your mind on the basis of the evidence. And this was the famous Lucas critique to the adaptive expectation hypothesis that was behind the Phillips curve. Okay, and then we have something which is in a sort of intermediate between the two, is called adaptive learning hypothesis. In other words, you allow people to adjust, to revise their expectation as your evidence turn up. So it's not completely passive adaptive hypothesis, but is a sort of ways to capture the fact that people react to the evidence. If you have assumed all the time that things are going to be like the past, and in fact, these expectations are disappointed because the future turns out to be different from the past, then of course you adapt your expectation to the new evidence. But these approaches are very much theoretical. Okay, they are theoretical in the sense that they are meant to be used to model behavior for testing purposes. And so you set up a model and you introduce this kind of hypothesis for the purpose of testing the model. There are other approaches to understand how people form expectation, which are not so much theory laden. And these are survey methodology. Namely, you ask people what they think the future will be like. So it's not that you introduce a theoretical assumption, but just you ask people, what do you think the consumption level will be next? What do you think the inflation rate will be next, and so forth. And while up to a certain point, these were very qualitative response, such as, do you think that inflation will rise next year? Do you think that prices will go down, and so forth? Since the early 90s, respondents have been asked to report probabilistic expectation. In other words, they were asked much more specific, and if you want, perhaps less clearly testable response, such as, on which probability do you think that prices will increase? What is the probability that inflation will rise? Or what is your interval of confidence for your expectation? The question, this is the background of the theory, of the analysis of expectations. And now let's get to what I think is the focus that I would like to draw your attention to in this paper. So what is the role of expectation? Okay, and in theory, what is the importance that in a given theory we give to expectation? And then I don't want just to look at expectation, but I want also to look to notions such as conjecture and beliefs, because you form your expectation on the basis of some kind of conjecture about how the work is like, how the world, is like, and on the basis of the beliefs that you have about the working of the system, and then also on the basis of how confident you are on a particular expectation that you make. Okay, so I might say, I believe that prices will increase because I think that the economic system works in a particular way, and I believe that some influence are at work now. But then I'm left also with the question, how confident am I on this conjecture? How confident? Or am I sure that this is what really happens? Or I say maybe something that, in other words, pertains to the notion of degree of confidence. So all these complex issues, how are they conveyed and conceptualize in theoretical context. In other words, these are relevant questions that each theoretical construct has to incorporate and explain why one theory might be different from another, okay? Because there are several ways in which you can conceptualize these ideas. So I think that conjecture and beliefs are complementary to the concept of expectation. And they are complementing because they indicate the hypothetical nature of these concepts, okay? Because when you introduce the notion of expectation, you have to introduce also the idea of the degree of confidence of this expectation. And then you have to also try to understand how these expectations are subjective. And they are subjective both in the sense that people evaluate the evidence on the basis of which they form their expectation differently. When you are confronted with the same evidence, you do not react also in the same way, because you assess the evidence on the basis of your beliefs, on the basis of your knowledge, and so on. And so the evaluation of the evidence on the basis of which you form an expectation is extremely variable among people, among individuals. In standard theoretical mainstream economics, the way in which this problem are dealt is through frequency probability distribution. You know, with most model, you have a frequency distribution, a probability of a given event, and then on the basis of which most of the decision making is modeled, okay? And so probability distribution, theory probability becomes a crucial tool for the representation of expectation in theory. What I would like to present to you is alternative representation of the way in which expectations are formed, which do not rely on the assumption that they can be modeled through a probability distribution. And why is this? Why is this? Either because that particular view of probability is not accepted, or because this is considered to be too rigid assumption that people have a probability distribution of future event on the basis of which they make decision. And so for these alternative theoretical works, the drivers of economic behavior are very different from the one which assumes that people have a probability distribution of future event. And because of these reasons, the approach that is typical to mainstream economics is not followed in this alternatives approach. So what I do here is to represent, to portray a model of inquiry into expectation by these three Cambridge authors, in which expectations are not, repeat, conceptualized or modeled on the basis of a probability distribution. Okay, they are not. These three authors, they all share the view that when you want to address the question how people form expectation, how people make choices on the basis of expectation, the basis of a probability distribution is not an helpful one. And why is this is so? Well, can be, I think, in certain cases, is a clearly stated opposition. As we know, Keynes wrote a book to oppose the idea that frequency probability distribution is a good way to model or to represent how people face decision in base of uncertainty. Some people might say, well, they did not have the appropriate technique, and because they were old-fashioned, they, you know, these people they didn't have all the technique that we have now in econometrics, in mathematical economics, and that's why They were opposed to something they did not fully understood. By the way, seems to me a very poor explanation. And I tend to follow a different explanation, which is the idea that the research approach, the approach to economics that they share is certainly different. And maybe there are more than one answer to this question. Why all these three economists oppose the idea of using probability distribution to explain expectation forming and decision making. Be as it may, I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are great similarities among these three authors. And of course, this is not surprising since Keynes was a pupil of Marshall and Kahn was a pupil of Keynes. So there is a family resemblance there, even if I would like to underline that while they share a similar approach, of course, the individual brought to the table different aspects of the problem. And that's what we will do now. Second question that I want to draw your attention to is that why is all this relevant apart from the interest for history of economic thought per se? Well, I think this is particularly relevant because we know that expectation has an important role to play in generating market instability or market instability. And especially in financial market, we know that the role of expectation through herd behavior, through various elements which are particularly frequent in financial market, expectation may have a very, very disruptive role to play. So try to understand whether there is a way in which we can understand how expectation are forms may give us a better insight of the working of this market. Because as we know, after the Lehman Brothers crisis and the disruption of financial market, all these models, which were based on a probability distribution, failed dramatically. And so there is a need now to find a better theoretical framework to analyze how expectation unfold. Finally, there is also another issue which has more interest for the historian of economic thought, and whether, within the so-called heterodox camp, which of the two is more useful as an approach to expectation. On the one hand, we have the so-called Cambridge tradition, which gives, like Keynes, John Robinson, and all the follower Kahn, all the follower of the Cambridge tradition, that give us a great importance to subjective quantities. In other words, the role of expectation is very important for the core of the theory. On the other hand, we have within the same Cambridge tradition, but related more to the work by Sraffa, is the idea that yes, expectation might be important in reality, but they should not have a major role in the theory. In other words, the theory should be concerned with observable quantity. As we know, expectations are not observable, they are subjective. And so the idea is that while it is, of course, understood perfectly well that in reality expectation have a role to play, when it comes to the theory, the question is whether we really need to have all these subjective expectations to play a major role in determining, say, equilibrium prices and so forth. So this is another issue why this matter might have some relevance. Okay, so let's start with our first author, Alfred Marshall. And I want to give you perhaps a different way to look at his contribution to this matter. We all know that Marshall is usually identified with supply and demand apparatus, whether in the short period and long period, and we are all used to the idea that supply and demand are just what they look like, something that doesn't have much behind it, apart from the way in which they are derived on the basis of individual choices, profit maximization on the one hand and utility maximization on the other. But I want you to look at the supply and demand also as situation in which expectations are fulfilled. In other words, individuals, agents, okay, they behave on the basis of a given environment. Okay, so that's what for Marshall is important. They are not Robinson Crusoe. They live in a society. They are part of a given trade. They are part of a given institutional framework. And so when they make decisions, they follow also certain routines that are derived on the basis of the knowledge, okay, that they have of that particular market. If you are a grain broker or if you are a cotton trader, okay, the way in which you form your expectations and therefore you become a supplier of that commodity reflects very much the kind of routine expectation that you know of your trade. And so if individual do not, this particular trader, say the cotton trader, the grain merchant, and so on the basis of their routine, on the basis of their knowledge, on the basis of their environment, if they see no reason to expect and change, okay, in that particular set of circumstances, they behave in such a way that their expectations are confirmed. So expectation can be seen as a sort of way to make things happen exactly in the way in which people expect them to be. And that's why they can call them conformity behavior. So they generate a situation because all the people share the same view, or they share the same experience, they share the same knowledge of that particular market, and therefore they say they follow a routine that make things happen on the basis of the expectation that have generated the circumstances. So equilibrium, in a way, is the result of this conformity behavior. Not that agents behave as predicted by the model, okay, because they know the structure of the model of the economy. It's just because their behavior reflects their knowledge and they share this knowledge, this routine, and therefore this is the way why their expectations are confirmed. That doesn't mean, of course, that there are no differences among individuals, because expectation formation, of course, derive from individual assessment of the given circumstances. It is true that these circumstances are part of an environment which is characterized by custom and practice, but which are specific to the trade of business, to the cotton trade, to the grain business, or to whatever business we are considering. So we are not saying that they are not subjective element. Otherwise, we would not have any dynamics in the system. The point is that in equilibrium, so even if individual may differ from one another, the equilibrium situation is defined as the situation in which these expectations are shared by a class of participants in that market. And this does not necessarily mean optimality, but conformity to expectation and forecast. So you can see the way in which individual may deviate from the general view of the market is allowed, but when we have an equilibrium situation is because we have a conformity of behavior, which is possible by the fact that this individual, on the basis of their knowledge and their experience, are drawn to behave in a way which makes the outcome be stable. So it's not because individuals have perfect foresight or they know the future, but they adjust through trial and error to market twists and turns. And of course, there will be individual will be better than others in doing so, and they will make a better decision. And those who are making better decision are those which the market will of course reward. So the idea is that you have a trial and error mechanism in which people adjust behavior, adjust expectation, adjust their behavior in such a way that in the end, when you have an equilibrium, this become consistent. This become consistent within a given market. So to conclude on this aspect, I would say that in Marshall, the role of expectation is to make possible a market equilibrium, both in the short and long run. And this is, equilibrium is conceived and seen as a stopping rule for choices. By agent, they are all identical, they are not identical agent, but they all share at one point the view of the market and they behave accordingly. Okay, so that was Marshall. I'm not sure that all the people who are listening to this talk know exactly who Richard Kahn is, but let me just say briefly, while I assume that everybody knows what Marshall is, Kahn was Keynes' favorite pupil. He wrote his dissertation in the late 20s. Of course, perhaps is most famous for being the inventor of the multiplier, you know, what every student learn in first year macroeconomics, 1 over 1 minus C. And he is also famous because he was an important figure in the, after Keynes died, being his literary executor and the one who, together with John Robinson, made sure that the Keynesian legacy was carried forward. Why do I introduce Kahn here? Because Kahn is the inventor of another concept, which he carried over from Marshall, but I think he gave it a twist to it, which is very important for the role of expectation. We all know that short period is a situation in which we assume that capacity is given and only the level of utilization of this capacity can take place, okay? But what can introduce to the idea of short period is the idea that the length of the short period is determined by the belief of those who make decision about capacity, namely the entrepreneur, how these beliefs are. Let me give you a better example on this. Depending on whether the entrepreneurs believe the change in demand to be transitory or permanent as compared with the level considered normal, the decision whether to modify in plant or organization, which are typically long period decisions, will or will not be taken. Okay, so please pay attention to the word believe. Okay, so in the short period, I have to decide whether or not to change the level of, to modify the plant, okay? I do modify the plant, namely I jump into the long period, only if I believe that increase in demand is going to be permanent, okay? If I believe that they are going to be, suppose I'm a producer of shoes and I see that there is a change in demand, an increase in demand for shoes. So now I'm faced with a decision whether to increase my capacity to produce more shoes or not. Whether or not I make that decision will depend, of course, on whether I believe that this increase in demand is going to be permanent, okay? And how do I know that? Well, I compare what I believe in my head to be the normal level of demand, okay? If I'm used to a particular level of demand for my shoes, and then I observe a change in that level of demand. I compare what I consider to be normal, and whether what I see as a change is permanent. I consider it to be permanent, and if it is permanent, of course, I will modify the plan. If it is not permanent, and I consider it to be temporary, then of course, I will not make that decision, and I will simply modify the level of utilization of my plant. So if, say, the majority of entrepreneurs do not have an expectation that a given increase in demand is likely to be permanent and to last, of course, there will be no investment in capacity. And that's what is interesting. So the short period would last forever. So we are in a short period, but in a short period, they last forever because the expectations are not such that you expect the demand increase to be permanent. And so you are stuck in a situation of short period. And this is an interesting because there is an asymmetry there in the length of the short period. Okay, in the boom, your expectations are such that increasing production is preferred to building up capacity. But the short period, therefore, can be very short. Okay, they are very short because you expect that this is going to last and innovation are introduced. While in a depression, people expect the demand will return to the normal level, and therefore they are not eager, okay, to do anything else, and they are stuck in a situation in which the short period can last for a long time. Okay, so what is interesting here are two aspects. One, as you can see, the Kahn short period is very similar to unemployment equilibrium in Keynes sense. You know, the general theory is set in a short period, and the idea is that you can stay in that unemployment equilibrium forever because the expectations are such that people do not have great faith in the future level of demand, and so they stop investing and they stay in the short period forever. The other concept that is carried over from Kahn by Keynes is the idea there is a normal level of something, okay? And this normal level is in the mind, and in the mind of people. So in the case of Keynes, if you think to the theory of liquidity preference, there is a normal level of the rate of interest, which is in the mind of each speculator, which is the parameter that you decide whether the market rate of interest will rise or fall, and consequently, whether you will be entirely in money or in bonds, okay? So as you can see, this idea that there is a normal level of a variable, which is the benchmark against which individuals compare what they observe in reality for that particular variable, this is very similar to Kahn's idea of level of investment being driven by whether expectations of the level of demand are going to be permanent or temporary, and is very similar to Keynes' idea that there is a normal level of interest rate on the basis of which people form their expectations about the future level of interest rates, okay? So this approach to expectation is characterized by two aspects, okay? One, the duration of the effect. How long is that permanent? Is that I expect something to be permanent or to be temporary? Because that would make a very, as we have seen, a great difference between the two cases. Whether it is permanent, I act in one way. If I think this variation is temporary, I will react in another way. And then, of course, there is the degree of confidence in which I held these expectations. You know, I might be entirely sure, I may be hesitant. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. So in this approach, expectations are interpreted as conjecture with different degrees of beliefs, okay? And this different degree of beliefs may be entertained among individuals, namely each individual will have her or his conjecture, but also within each individual. I myself, I might be induced to make that decision because I have a strong belief in my conviction, or I might not act in a particular way because the belief I have in that situation is not so strong. And so I do not act, even if I have that expectation, because I'm not entirely sure of how strong my convictions are. And what is important, and this degree of confidence should not be interpreted as the variance of a distribution of probability, as you might have if you know Tobin model or portfolio. This is not something that can be so easily measured through a probability distribution as a variance. You know, the variance giving you the degree of uncertainty about a given probability. Now, so now we get to Keynes, okay? Keynes, as we know, is very important for the role he gives to expectation. And as also it is very well known. Unlike the case of short-term expectation, Keynes opposed the idea that long-term expectation could be formed on the basis of on any rationality. There is famous sentence in the general theory in which he said, there is no way that we can predict whether there's going to be a war in 30 years. And I think this COVID-19 situation is a typical example of that. No one could have expected what happened just even a few months ago. So the future is very uncertain, and the rational basis for forming expectation is very whimsical. That doesn't mean that people cannot make rational deduction from the evidence. The best you can do is to assess the evidence and to derive the implication for this conjecture, but you have not, this means to be rational. That doesn't mean that this is going, that because you're rational is going to be right, nor even worse, that if you're rational, you're going to predict exactly the future. So being rational is the way in which, the only way in which you can deal with the future, trying to derive implication from the evidence, to assess the evidence, to use your knowledge and your expertise to derive implication from the evidence, but that doesn't mean that you will be right, nor that you will be able to predict the future. In particular, because conjecture are subjective. You know, as I said already, they are related to personal beliefs, according to what people believe in reality. There was a famous example in Keynes' Treatise on Probability, in which people react differently to different information. I observe the barometers, and the barometers say it's going to rain, and I'm a scientific mind. I tend to believe the barometers, while I'm not so much a scientific mind, and I look at the sky, I see blue sky outside, and therefore I say, forget about the barometers. I believe that what gives you the right information is the color of the sky. And on the basis of these two different beliefs, I may or may not carry an umbrella when I go out. Okay, so this carrying an umbrella might not be a very important decision to make, but this just to give an example that people react differently to the same information, or they choose a particular evidence on the basis of which they make their expectation and their decisions. So the individual information this was not just Keynes, but was also Ellsberg, who talk about the ambiguity of the individual information concerning the likelihood of the event. And so this makes the business of treating probability distribution as a secure basis to model the very faulty indeed. So ambiguity means that beliefs have some, but not all the structure of the probability distribution. Something is missing that does not allow to treat information in this manner. So we have to keep always distinct how individuals form their expectation from how confident they are on this expectation. And these distinctions allow us to see that we should be very suspicious of deterministic results when we come to the question of expectation and future predictions. Exactly because there is this element of ambiguity, this element of confidence that makes deterministic result very doubtful, okay? And of course, when confidence in expectation is such a variety in markets, this is one of the reasons why market might generate instability. And so behavior, rather than being conducive to stability, is rather conducive to instability. In fact, especially in financial market, the importance of uncertainty of the expectation has been singled out as one of the main causes of financial instability. And this is what in the 2008 financial market crisis had brought attention to the fact that mainstream theory disregard so much uncertainty. They thought that they could model everything, that uncertainty could get rid of with this probability, attached probability value to all outcome. And this is unfortunately turned out to be total disaster, since the financial market behaved in a completely different model. Now we have representative agent models in which they have built variety of expectation formation. They call it chartist, fundamentalist, extrapolate. So people have been playing around a lot with way in which we could introduce expectation in order to have better models to deal with these issues. I'm not sure that we are entirely successful, but we know, sorry, but we know that we have to take into consideration that we cannot treat the future as just an extrapolation of the past. Apart from these theoretical exercises, there are other approaches to the question of how individuals make their decisions on the basis of a combination of different type of expectation. We know that there is a literature which is called behavioral experimental economics, in which the attempt is to understand how people react to given situations. So you set up an experiment, and then you reward people on the basis of the decision they make. And this is a kind of literature that have shown, among other things, that the standard mainstream approach shows that people behave in a very different way according to the circumstances. And I think that behavioral economics and laboratory experiment had brought up an interesting evidence on how people behave. And I think that when it comes to financial market, experimental evidence has been much, much superior to the kind of results that we had in macroeconomics models. In particular, what is relevant that in financial market, you have a sort of higher degree expectation. What matters not just what your expectations are, but what your expectation of other people's expectations, okay? Such in a beauty context, which was what Keynes said in his famous example, that people try to guess what other people would choose as the most beautiful person in the context, or reflexivity, that's what Giorgio said, is at work in financial market, you choose on the basis of what you think other people will choose in the market. And so this introduced a higher degree of expectation. And this is interesting enough. This was already anticipated by Marshall in an unpublished manuscript, in which he said already very, very early, much before Keynes, much before Foros, speculators govern their action not by their own forecast of the distant future, but that they are forecast of the forecast which will be made by less competent people. So Soros challenged the idea that financial market can be, that theory can incorporate the risk factor in pricing mechanism in the way in which it's done, precisely because of this reflexivity being at work in this market. Then we have another strand of literature in which you try to learn and to understand expectation, not on the basis of a model, not on the basis of assuming individual optimizing choices, but try to see whether you have some observable variable that can help you to single out how people in market form their expectation, okay? And prediction of the future prices, for instance, are elicited by giving, for instance, monetary incentive in experiments, or if you take the literature related to, which goes back to working in 1949, to look at future markets, in which you try to use future market, which are the market in which expectation about the future prices will reveal themselves. And this kind of literature as look at the future market as a way to understand what the future would be like. So if you want to understand what the market think the dollar will be in say 1 year time, you look at the future price of the dollar, say, as quoted in the future market in a year time. And so for other commodity. Finally, I want to say something about expectation as a dividing issue between the so-called post-Keynesian and neo-Ricardians. I already mentioned that for Keynes and his follow, uncertainty is always there when you have to analyze decision-making, and therefore you have to introduce expectation whenever you talk about any variable in the economic system, while the Sraffian and the Sraf approach is the emphasis on looking for the objective basis of market price and determination, and try to leave the non-observable entities a little bit in the background, and try to look at custom and social norms rather than individual subjective expectation. Why? Because subjective expectations are not observable. You have to assume are there, but they are not observable. So let me conclude by saying that both Marshall, Kahn, and Keynes placed the green tracks on expectation, and they did not endorse the idea that they could be formalized in a model. It was not because they didn't have the expertise. The three of them were trained mathematicians. They all graduated in mathematics. They just did not trust statistical inference. They thought it was not fit to be applied to economics. In particular, Keynes made contribution to the rejection that frequency distribution could be applied to understand economic phenomena. And this is interesting that before World War II, many economists did not like the idea of using probability theory to explain behavior. And it was just after the Second World War that, with the development of econometrics and probability and so on, economists moved in that direction. I think that Sraffa was even more radical to say that we should not base our theory on unobservable entities. And he went so far as to expunge them for the analysis of the problem he had in mind, namely price and distribution. And on the contrary, Marshall, Keynes, and Kahn thought it was part of it. And I think that this unfortunately led to irreconcilable views of theory of price and distribution. And this is the situation in which we find ourselves. So my conclusion is that while several of the points made, and which I've tried to illustrate in his talk, are certainly not unique to this author. Other people, other economists, think of Frank Knight, just to give an example, as introduced this radicality of rejection, of probability distribution to explain uncertainty and risk. But I think that their arguments are specific to certain aspects, which I thought that justify the interest that we might have in revising them. Thank you very much again. And this is the end of my talk. Okay. Don't know what's happening.
Thank you, Professor.
You there? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.